Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University Podcast Network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences, in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fire University. Today we're going to talk about burning for deer and talk about deer habitat and the timing of fire and all the nuances that we think about when we're using fire to manage for deer. So I have Dr. Bronson Strickland, who you may know from Deer University at Mississippi State University, and also Dr. Will Gulsby, who is the habitat specialist at Auburn University. So thanks guys for coming. I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to us about this. I'm really excited about this topic since it's one that I work on quite a bit. I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, this topic is near and dear to your heart, Marcus. I know that. I have a feeling you're going to figure out some way to talk about burning as well in this episode. But happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, happy to be here, Marcus. And Bronson, I see what you did there with the near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, you didn't say.
Pun intended.
Yeah, I noticed that you said your instead of my. So is fire not important to your heart, Tom?
Yeah. It's probably a bigger part of your heart than mine. Yeah.
I could go along with that,
but it's certainly an important part of my heart too.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to take too much time. We put some links in the bio and some information about it, each of you, so that if people are interested, they can look there. But I wanted to talk to you both about your thoughts on how we could use fire for different reasons and the caveats and nuances with using fire to manage for deer. So, Will, I know that you've had quite a few research projects here in the recent past where you were specifically using fire to manage for deer. And I was curious about a couple of things that you've worked on. One of the things that I think is really important for us to cover first is why would we even want to use fire to manage deer habitat?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one of the most fundamental ones that I try to cover, with my students when I'm teaching classes related to prescribed fire, is that, a lot of people, I think, incorrectly think of fire differently than a lot of the other management alternatives that we use as habitat managers. Really, fire is a tool just like, an implement that we could hook up to a tractor, a sprayer, a disc, some type of mower, any of those things. We're just using them to manipulate vegetation. And, for the most part, we're talking about for deer vegetation under about 6 feet in height, stuff that they can hide in, stuff that they can reach to forage on. So, when I think of fire and deer, I think of it as a tool to try to manipulate vegetation composition and structure so that it better provides for whatever habitat component we are interested in providing to deer in a certain area. And, the two main ones, like I've already mentioned, are cover and forage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. So really what we're using the fire to do is either create a really high quality foraging area or create a really high quality cover area that they may bed in or loaf in or use for different reasons, maybe to escape us.
Sure.
Or other predators.
And then, of course, it's not all black and white. We can have an area that does provide both cover and forage, but either time you start pushing an area, using fire frequency to one of those ends of the spectrum or the other, you start to lose a little bit from the other end of it. For example, if we want to go with a longer than traditional return interval, let's say we push it all the way to like 4 to 5 years between fires to try to increase the amount, make some really shrubby cover, for bedding cover and escape cover in an area, we're going to lose the value of that area in terms of providing, high protein forage during the spring and the summer months. And in contrast, if we're pushing an area with very frequent fire, let's say every 2 years, to try to provide more of that high quality forage during spring and summer, we're going to lose some of the cover component from it.
Hmm. Yeah, it was interesting. Before we got on, we were talking about just this, and you were given an example of a place that you had worked where the landowner was using fire more frequently. Do you want to discuss with the audience kind of what, when you're using fire really frequently, the kinds of things you could expect? And then I think we could switch to Bronson and kind of give the anecdote on the other side of that, since we had some work that we did together that was sort of the opposite of that in some ways.
Yeah, so I was working with a landowner. He had just acquired this property within the past 5 to 6 years, and it was unique in the sense that most of these properties that someone has relatively recently acquired, they're unburned, right? And you have to promote timber harvest. You have to promote introduction of prescribed fire, but he was already doing a good bit of that, and in fact, he had most of the upland pine stands, and most of the property overall was upland pine stands, already on a 1 to 2 year burn rotation. And he was getting lots and lots of pictures of deer at night, particularly during, just before the hunting season, like during that late summer, early fall period. But then when they started to hunt during daylight hours and the hunting season would come around, not only were they not seeing deer from the stand, but they also just weren't getting photographs of deer elsewhere on the property. So one of the first things that I recommended to that landowner is that at least in some areas of the property, we don't want everything to look the same. We usually want a mosaic, like we were talking about earlier, areas providing more forage, areas providing more cover. So we still want that, but I started talking about let's decide where we want to use fire a little bit less frequently, at least on some portions of this property, so that we have more cover to make deer feel comfortable using the property during the daylight hours. Maybe they'll venture out not too far from that cover, but they'll come out some, right? And lo and behold, he started to implement that. And a few years later, he had some areas that had a lot more woody vine cover, particularly on this property. We saw a lot of muscadine and a lot of blackberry cover come up pretty quickly. And they've enjoyed greater hunting success since then. And this year they killed, the best buck that they've killed on that property to date. So overall, that strategy has been pretty successful for them.
I think you said a couple of things that are key, and I think this will be a great segue into what I think Bronson will say about this same topic. But you don't want everything to be the same, and if you're burning that frequently, you're really targeting food, just like you would in a food plot.
I would agree.
And I know initially it's kind of this, oh my gosh, I don't want deer to stop using my property during the day. But think about what happens in your food plot. If you have really high quality food source, but not much cover, the same thing happens during hunting season in food plots, right? Deer start to use them more at night, or are harder to see if they're getting pressure in that food plot. And I think we all observe that. So just because they aren't using that during the day doesn't mean it's not usable for them, but you'd probably want to have some other areas on a little longer return interval, like you were saying, to provide cover. It sounds like maybe juxtaposed to that food resource, just like you would do with a food plot. Bronson, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about some of the properties that you've worked on. They're kind of on the other side of that coin.
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of saw a little bit different response, but I think based on how you describe the property, and as I described this one, I think we can figure out pretty easily why we saw a different response. So we're on a property heavily hunted on the periphery all around, as you might imagine. And following, and Marcus, you may help me here, probably year 2 and into year 3, but it was several years in a row. is we actually saw more deer activity during daylight hours after sun up, and actually when deer season began. So we've got heavy hunting pressure, or at least moderate, normal hunting pressure on the periphery.
You're
And we
talking about
have
like the beginning of rifle season, Bronson?
exactly.
Is that what you're, okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, rifle season. So my neck of the woods, think November, and saw elevated use of these burn stands. But one thing that might be a different than the example you're giving is that we had a very low basal area that makes your traditional forester cringe a little bit. So it was above 40 and less than 50. And so the canopy is more or less wide open. And so we saw a very quick response via vegetation, such that we're talking 3 feet or greater vegetation. So we're providing food and concealment cover, such that if you were to jack up in a climbing stand, you're going to be able to see, the head pop up of a deer as it's moving through that stand during daylight hours. So they still felt secure, even though it's during daylight hours. So what I'm guessing, Will, and please correct me, is that if we were in a more kind of normal above 70 or maybe 80 basal area and only 10% sunlight, 20% sunlight, we're not going to get that vegetation response. Herbaceous vegetation is going to be lower to the ground, and they're going to feel more or less like, even though they're in the forest, they're going to feel like they're in a food plot because they're exposed.
Right.
So there's all these little intricate details you have to consider. How long has it been? What was the basal area? What was the vegetation response?
Right. Totally agree. And I think that's why it's so important when we're having these fire discussions that we don't treat all burned areas equally. At a minimum, we oftentimes mention frequency, or return interval, however you want to phrase it. But, we don't oftentimes talk about how an area burned on the same, 2 or 3 year rotation looks in an area that has an 80 basal area versus a 40 basal area. And the vegetation responses in those two conditions are going to look very different. There's an interaction there where the response to fire is dependent on canopy cover. And that's exactly right on that property, Bronson. The standard was, 70 to 80 square feet per acre was the basal area that we had in those stands. And so not only was he burning very frequently, but also the vegetation response was slower because of the plants in the understory were sunlight limited.
Yeah, those are great points. Another thing that I would add into it, after working on this topic area in a whole bunch of places, there seems to be not only that interaction between the canopy, how broken it is and how much sunlight's getting in and the frequency of fire, but also with the productivity of the site. And I've gone from a place where it was literally the poorest soil in the entire range of deer to the site that you're talking about, Bronson. It's, sort of upper mid road in terms of soil productivity.
I'd call it moderate, normal for the southeast. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty standard for what most sites are going to be in the coastal plain. So that's also an interesting thing. If you're in Sandhill, the fire return interval might need to be lengthened on top of getting sunlight in.
So, Marcus, what would you say is the return interval that you would target in Sandhills? Because I don't have much experience burning there. If your primary goal for the area is to maximize summer deer forage?
That's a really good question, and I think it's sort of like these other ones that we're talking about. So when I was actually out doing this in Sandhill and measuring deer forage production, we tend to get the most good food, so the most plants and the most biomass of those plants and the highest quality of those early in the rotation. But you would want the rotation to be a little bit longer, especially if you're interested in having some of that concealment cover with the biomass. And we're looking at more of a 4 or 5 year rotation on those sites. The problem is in that kind of site is we often have a competing objective where we're trying to either remove or decrease the woody composition in that. So we have invading plants that are undesirable for the structure of the system. So that we tend to stay on the more frequent side, at least depending on the time of the year that you're burning, which also can have a pretty dramatic effect, as I think you guys would agree, and maybe we'll talk about some more. So yes, it's a good question. This is one of the reasons I really love fire is because there are all kinds of questions, literally you and I will at least are spending a lot of our career trying to answer those kinds of questions to deliver this kind of information to people that want to use it. So there are plenty of caveats, and I think it's fun for us to talk about them.
Right. And, to contrast that, none of my research sites are in black belt soils, but I have worked with some landowners that have land in the black belt of Alabama. And some of those areas I would absolutely, if I wanted to maximize summer deer forage, I would burn them every year.
Mm-hmm. And my family's, where I grew up, and my family's land is in the black belt, and for forage production, you're right on.
Yeah.
And once you get out past 2 or 3 years, it's going to get pretty hairy in there. It's a really good cover for several years. But
hey, Will, for people that aren't from the Southeast, what's unique about those black belt soils? What's so special about them?
They're much, especially compared to many areas of the Southeast, they're much more neutral to even alkaline in terms of their pH. Much more productive, rich soils, something that would be on par with a lot of the more productive soils that you might find in the agriculturally dominated areas of the Midwest. And so that's very unusual for us to have in the Southeast. Most of our soils are acidic and relatively poor.
Yeah. Well, we have a little finger of that, 2 fingers really that run into Mississippi, not as extensive as in Alabama, but it's like what we always do, Will. We have to compare most of Mississippi to the Delta.
Yep.
Because of the difference in those soils and the response of them. So,
right.
Yeah, pretty cool.
Well, I think for our listeners, if you're not from Alabama or Mississippi, up in northern Mississippi at least, you may not be familiar with that. But just go and look on Google. You can see this crescent shape, this sort of like a seatbelt over the shoulder of Mississippi, and then it's sort of like a belt across Alabama. And you can see it from an aerial. It's tends to be less forested in that. It traditionally was black prairie, and it's really visible. The other thing that I think is really interesting is go and look at a soil productivity map, and you can see exactly what you're saying, Will. There's even some places that are ranking near the highest productivity soil in the United States. There's a couple of little slivers of that in Alabama, right there along the black belt. It's ranking up near like some of the really high productivity soils that you'd find up in Wisconsin or up in that area. So it's really interesting. Most of them are on the upper end of productivity, but some of them are pretty extreme even in that productivity.
So Will, but because of that productivity, are you suggesting if you were managing just for food for deer, your fire interval would be a lot less? That's why you said 2 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be the general trend but with both forage and cover, on a more productive site, you're probably going to have to burn more often than you would relative to a low soil productivity site. I think that's why I always emphasize when I'm teaching about use of prescribed fire to manipulate habitat for deer or any other species is your post-burn evaluation, not only immediately after the fire, but maybe a growing season later is so important to make sure that benchmark that you're starting with is actually achieving the desired results. And if it's not, you can manipulate it from there.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great point. And just to add to that, for folks out there that are thinking about this, those higher productivity sites pretty commonly can get away from you if you go a little bit longer. And what I mean by that is you can start getting trees like sweet gums and elms and that sort of stuff that we're trying to to keep at bay in the understory or get rid of altogether, they can pretty quickly get up into the mid-story and start producing a lot of shade that you don't want when you're managing for many species, but certainly for deer. They can get up quicker. So it's important to think about that frequency from that standpoint as well.
Absolutely.
So I think we could switch gears just a little bit here. And I want to think about fire relative to the biology of the animal, and maybe how we could change timing and or frequency. And we can go whichever way you want with this, but just thinking about, what do deer need at different times of the year, and how could we manipulate fire regimes in general to accommodate those things?
I'll jump in and start. And I guess those that have listened to me yak about this in the past, they've probably heard me talk about it many times. But for those people outside of the Southeast, it might be kind of hard to envision that we really have two nutritionally stressful periods in the Southeast. And up north, it is really obvious. Winter can be really, really tough for a deer to make it through for obvious reasons. Really cold, a lot of snow, etc. Forage is limited. The environment's tough. But what a lot of people don't realize, unless you've lived through a summer in South Alabama, for example, or South Mississippi, that's a tough environment too. Really hot, humid, and forage as a result. You think about these annual plants and perennial plants, and Marcus and Will have run a fire, and those plants have colonized, and they're really nutritious for spring and most of the summer. But we get kind of to the end of the growth cycle of some of those annual plants, and they're getting to be much, much lower quality. So they begin to die, senesce, etc., even perennial plants. So we have a really stressful period, temperature-wise, environment-wise, and then the quality of a lot of these naturally occurring forages are really, really low. So what is unfortunate for a deer is that's a very important time in their life cycle, in terms of bucks growing antlers, in terms of them rebuilding their bodies. And then, of course, with does, they're gestating fawns. They're either in their last trimester, or they've already had fawns and they're beginning to lactate. And just a reminder, lactation is just as nutritionally demanding, believe it or not, as the last trimester of gestation. So we have a period of time that I kind of call it the tissue generation, the tissue rebuilding part of a deer. And that is when we have one of these nutritional bottlenecks that's occurring. And so anytime we can incorporate these habitat treatments, that's going to provide a bump in the biomass and quality of food at that time of year, we are strategically addressing this nutritional bottleneck that deer are experiencing.
So Bronson, just to be a little more specific about the timing of that. So you're saying that we kind of have a green up, and then the phenology of the plants. When are we starting to see them senesce in general in the Southeast?
I would be very general, because there's lots of different plants and different growth forms, but I typically think of it this way, and you guys can correct me. I think September is really, really rough for a deer. That can bleed into August, it can bleed into October. But some of our evidence when we're looking at deer in the fall, their condition, the most sensitive month of the year, the evidence suggests is September. And how hot is it, how much rainfall we got, etc. And it just really coincides well with kind of the annual plant growth pulse, and them senescing and dying and being lignified and of lower quality.
Yeah, and that's intersecting still with the nutritional demands of the end of antler growth, I guess, if it's that late.
Right.
At the end of lactation in most cases as well.
Yeah. And so you're wanting bucks to be in their very best condition, because beginning in October and November, they begin their life cycle of, and people may not realize this, but because they have a switch up here hormonally, now they're thinking about the breeding season, and they actually voluntarily reduce their intake. They have a different priority from that point on all the way until antler drop. And so that we want them to go into that period of pre-rut and rut to be in the best possible condition.
Right. So there are a couple of ways, I guess. One way would be through habitat management, using things with fire, but also there are other ways that we try to make sure that they have plenty of access to high quality food, like supplemental food plots, for instance. That at least I think about the summer food plots as trying to address that late summer stress period, right?
Yeah.
That's really the key time that you want food available.
Yeah. And what is interesting, Marcus, like from some of our work with Jacob Dykes with his project, where we were really looking at this wasn't the focus of his project. It was more about what are they selecting. But when I go back and just look at the volume of use on those plots, it drops dramatically after spring green up. Even though we have all this wonderful forage production in these food plots, deer just aren't using them as much because of spring green up.
Right.
All the diversity of plants.
Yeah, just to clarify for folks, we do have some stuff online, and I remember you just posted recently about the deer, even when they have an ad libitum diet, they voluntarily during the breeding season stop eating, right? Which is really cool. That's available online, but we also have some stuff related to Jacob's project. And for those of you out there that may not have seen that was planting cool season stuff. And you're talking about, we go through several months where that's available and the use is really high. And then we get around to the spring green up and you saw the volume of use drop or plummet, I guess, of those forages, even though they're available and still nutritious.
Exactly. But then you start overlapping when your cool season is fading out in late spring and early summer. Then with warm season plots, you'll see that shift again. Getting back to your point, Marcus, about late summer, midsummer, and late summer, you see it shift again to where now they're using these food plots a lot more, because often the quality of the naturally occurring forages aren't as good as they used to be.
So without any other manipulation, because of the senescing plant community, that would shift even higher use to your cowpeas or soybeans or something like that. You planted joint veg.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I think a simple comparison or an analogy that you can use that probably makes sense to a fairly broad audience is if you've ever kept any livestock, any horses or cattle, you always think about the quality of first cut versus second cut versus like third cut hay. And you know that with each subsequent cut, as you get further into summer, the quality of that forage declines. And it's kind of the same thing that we're seeing in terms of deer forage, is those plants senesce, which is a fancy way of saying age, right? It's just the relative proportion of the digestible portion to the indigestible portion of the plant changing, and you see it increase particularly in structural carbohydrates that are less digestible to the animal, and it decreases as a result the amount of nutrition that an animal can gain from eating that same plant in August or September or October versus in June. And I think to add insult to injury, we also a lot of times during that same time of the year experience the lowest amount of precipitation. So these plants aren't producing any new growing tips, which we know are going to be the most nutritious parts of the plants and the parts that are most selected for by deer.
Yeah. Yeah, spot on, Will. Where we're at is over the past decade, September and October, especially October, is the driest month of the year, believe it or not. Yeah. So you kind of have those competing things going on.
Right. And so I think one of the challenges, if I can circle us back a little bit more to fire, one of the challenges associated with that is, we might think, okay, well, we have this tool available to us in prescribed fire that we could potentially use to set back some of that aging vegetation, thereby increasing its nutritional quality once again by making the plants younger. But then we start to run into issues with finding days that are good to burn during that time of the year. And that can be one of the greatest challenges we face with trying to use that tool later in the growing season.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think we should go right into that, and please do bring it back to fire. Yeah, so, and this is something that I work on a ton as well. We kind of get into this mindset that all fires are created equal. We don't think about all food plots being created equal. Most people don't, right? But a lot of people think of all fires being created equal, and there's some real differences in the timing of fire that I think are important for us to talk about here. And Bronson and I worked on a project together that I think addresses some of this really well that we can talk about. And I know that you've worked on some similar things, Will, that address some of these points. But a couple of things in terms of the burn window, we put out on the UF lab here recently a thing just kind of trying to show people how quickly your burn window can be whittled away to nothing.
I saw that. Yeah, that was a great post.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. It was kind of, to me, I've always talked about that, but I never went in and actually tried to figure out, okay, how many days are we actually talking about? And it turns out in the average year, you get about 90 burn days where you could actually pull a permit and it will burn, and you can do that. Obviously, that changes a lot depending on your context. If you're in upland hardwoods, for instance, a couple of months that you have an option to burn in pine, you don't really have in hardwoods unless you're in a really wide open woodland structured hardwood forest where you're getting woodland, a hardwood woodland, where you're getting a lot of sunlight in, you have a lot of grass fuels. You might have the option, but in most places that's not the case. So you have more burn days that you can actually use fire probably in pinelands in most of the South, but yeah, excuse me. It was about 90 days a year, and it's like, oh well, that's plenty of burn days. But then you start thinking, oh well, people have a job, they don't want to burn during some times because it's hunting season, or things are nesting. We have all these different barriers. There's the Super Bowl. That's one of your days, the weekend. So yeah, we whittled it all the way down to 3 days, which was just kind of shocking to me. With people that I work with really commonly, I was just trying to think of all the common barriers, and that's not even all of them. And we whittled it all the way down to 3 days a year. And if you're not really taking fire seriously and using that as a tool seriously, you could very easily paint yourself into a corner where you really, even if you want to use it a little bit, you don't have very many days where you're actually going to be able to do that. So yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. But to kind of take this back to the biology of the animal, can either of you that want to talk about this is fine to chime in. Let's start with the beginning of the year and why you might use fire during the traditional fire window, kind of in that late winter time frame, and then maybe kind of move around the year and talk about the different reasons that you might want to target that outside of just extending the burn window. Let's talk about why you might want to from the standpoint of the biology of the animal.
Well, I'll start with the benefits of the traditional time of year, which we'd call the dormant season. And kind of as we talked about earlier, is we have, let's take bucks, for example. I mean, some of those guys are losing 20% or greater of their body weight. So if the the forest is managed, especially with a lower basal area, sunlight's able to get through the canopy, you are improving spring green up so much with the addition of fire. So there are going to be some plants that are present and deer are going to consume them. But my goodness, how much you can improve the amount of good biomass that's going to be coming online in April, for example, if you've included fire. So certainly there is a lot of merit to continue to do it in the traditional time of year for parts of your property. You're going to get that benefit. But then as I'll let Will jump in, but there's also benefits to doing it, other times of the year as well.
So to really conceptualize that, Bronson, you're not really necessarily talking about a strong composition change. Like you're not changing it from one type of plant to a different one necessarily, although you may have some effects. You're really talking about moving the biomass of plants from out of the reach back into reach. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, I would say that. And though you're probably, again, we can never say always, but then you're probably going to get some colonization and growth from annual plants as well. So I would say both of those would be occurring.
And when you have those collectively, whenever things start to green up, then you just have a whole bunch of high quality biomass available.
And you have diversity, allow deer to select. Exactly. So, I mean, you've got so many plants they can choose from based on what they want and what they need. Okay.
So if we move forward and we start getting into a March, April, maybe even a little later than that time frame, what outside of just extending the burn window so that you can accomplish more burning, are there any reasons that we might want to think about that time frame?
Yeah, one of the obvious benefits you've also already mentioned, Marcus, is extending the burn window. Mm-hmm. You can still find a lot of good burn days during March in particular, and for sure on into April as well. But I don't know, and I haven't directly measured this yet, but you and I, all three of us, are part of a study where we're starting to look at some of the nuance related to vegetation responses during these different times of the year. But I suspect that the vegetation response that you see in March and April is not that different from January to February. So I look at that time of the year as more of an opportunity to extend the burn window out into stands that I may not have otherwise gotten burned, versus that I'm looking for a different plant response.
Okay. It sounds like during that time frame, that's really about if you need more days to burn, those could get it. But in terms of the benefits that Bronson just outlined with the moving biomass back into reach and then increasing the diversity of plants, you're going to get very similar responses. Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty accurate based on the literature. Even if you go through, we commonly hear that we control hardwoods better, but I don't think the data consistently show that. And I know that the sites that I've worked on, that is not what happens. We really are getting a very similar thing. And even I think what we'll talk about next, and I'll switch it back to you, Bronson, to talk about the project that we did in Mississippi. Even that nutritional quality that might be really important during that late summer stress period. Even that you're not really gaining from being a few months later, in that March, April, even probably May timeframe. What about if we move it a little further than that? Or you can comment on that as well. I saw you had something to say.
Well, if I'm getting old, so my memory may be slipping, but what I took away from that is, again, it's always nuanced, and you really got to qualify what you're looking at and the impacts. Is that, at least for me, what I thought was your dormant season burn was going to provide more biomass that year, the year of mm-hmm. the burn and the following. But what was interesting is when you got into late summer, you were going to have, of course, you just burned, you're going to have far less biomass, mm-hmm. but the nutrient concentration and density of those plants was a lot greater. And
when you're saying that late growing season, are you fast forwarding to June?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I should have said that. Yeah, fast forward to June. So then you get into late summer, which is when we measured. So of course there's not as much biomass that time of year because you haven't had enough period of time for it to grow and respond.
Mm-hmm.
But the quality of it was greater, and it depends on the nutrient you measured and so forth.
Sure.
But to me, the greatest thing was thinking about the interplay of both, and how having both of those on your landscape or on your property was so good and so beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get the benefit, like Will's saying, you extend the life, the number of days that you can burn, and you're going to be changing the nutrient concentration of a lot of those plants. And then when you think about that time of the year, gestation, lactation, etc., even though the biomass may not be as great, you've got a lot of those plants that are super dense in crude protein, phosphorus, etc., which is really going to help them out a lot.
Yeah. I think there are a couple of things to make sure that we make very clear as well. So one thing, I guess, that you would lose potentially if you went from a February, March to a late March, April, early May, that green up, maximizing the available forage, you may actually do better with the earlier fire, because right when things are greening up, if in mid-April, for instance, you're removing a lot of that biomass, and then it'll be delayed to colonize. So, but if we compare that to not burning, if you're in a situation where you need to go ahead and get it burned and you didn't burn, you're probably still, even though you remove the biomass and then get that flush, you probably still have more good stuff to eat, biomass wise, even than you would have if you didn't burn, in many contexts at least. So, there are all of these things, we're talking about trade-offs, but in that case, it'd probably be better just to go ahead and get it burned, even though you may give up a little bit, than optimizing it for that springtime pulse. It would be better than going through that whole growing season, having everything in the mid-story where deer can't reach it at all, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's important. That's why it's important for managers to keep in mind the big picture when they're doing this. I don't want anybody to say, oh, I didn't get anything burned in January or February, so I didn't have any time in March, so I'm going to burn everything I needed to get done for deer this year in April, and think that, that's a bad thing, that they should let it lay out for a year or something like that, because they're going to be wiping that slate clean at a time when deer really start to need it. That's not the way to think about it. It's just, you can introduce, as you become more experienced in fire and understand more nuance about it, you can use these little, tidbits to think about, okay, when do I want to burn this area over here? When do I want to burn that area over there, to try to maximize everything? But that's something else that I like to talk about a lot with students, is that you have to realize that even for many of our fire dependent species, and deer in a forage sense and cover sense included in that, oftentimes with fire, when we first apply it, or even sometimes for even 2 years after we apply it, that area may not be optimal habitat for that species. There is a period of time where you have kind of a lag phase where use of it may be lower during that first period right after it's burned, or they're using it for a different purpose. And then 2 years later is when it's got the optimal level of both forage and cover value. And that's when it receives maximal use, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point. And just to kind of take it back to where Bronson was with, if we fast forward to that later season fire during June, which, if you own upland hardwoods and you're not getting a ton of sunlight in with a lot of grass as fuels, you probably can't even use. You won't be able to get it to burn unless the conditions are so dry that you probably have a burn ban or something. But what I think you're exactly right, Will. If you burned at that time, you're not going to have high quality fawning cover through the summer, but you may have another component really well. It sounded like, based on what Bronson was saying, now if you think about burning several months after growing season, and now you've reset the plant community again after they would have already greened up. right? So you necessarily have now delayed green up, if you think about it that way. And that sounds like where the benefit could come from that timing. We honestly don't have enough data. And like you were talking about, Will, we have a big, large scale experiment that we're all involved with to try to address this. We don't have enough data to really know how that's going to play out composition wise of the plants. But I know that I've done a lot of work and a lot of it with you, Bronson, looking at the nutritional quality and use of that June timeframe compared to like a March timeframe. And one of the things I think that is really telling is, first of all, in terms of the use of the animals during that nutritionally stressful late summer period, the use, they're following quality instead of biomass. Even though the dormant season fire, you'd get much more biomass, we were seeing a lot more use, even when we corrected for how visible they were and that sort of thing. A lot more use in the new stuff. And I really was thinking about that like a food plot. If you track the quality of the plants in it, it's not there. We don't have a huge biomass of them, but they're so much higher quality, especially when there's, most of the plants in the community and that aren't burned or senescing. That gap in nutritional quality of the same plant, they're almost like you have to change the scale of the figure, right, to see the top of the bars. Which is I think a pretty important thing. You're going to get one habitat component out of it that's probably really important during that specific time, but another one that might be desirable for you to have on the landscape is sort of missing with that fawning cover, which kind of gets us back to that. You don't want everything to look the same way, right? You don't want to burn all of it then, but you might get some real benefit from having both timings right there juxtaposed to one another, because you have a good place for a fawn to lay and then a good place for mom to meet her lactation requirements close by.
Right. And I mean, we throw out that diversity term all the time. This almost to the point where it's just a buzzword, but this is direct evidence of why that diversity is important.
Exactly.
And to really, lend validation to what you just explained, Marcus, related to Bronson's work. I'm part of a study right now where we're looking at deer use of areas, forested areas treated in different ways. And we had like a 2 to 2.5 fold increase in this study. I won't go into all the details to save time, but 2 to 2.5 fold increase in deer use of burned compared to unburned units.
Mm-hmm.
And what was really like troubling to me when we first started to get into these data is that if we looked at the overall coverage of preferred deer forage plants between burned and unburned in this particular study, they weren't that different for this treatment unit. Same thing with visual obstruction. A measurement that we take as an index of cover for deer didn't differ that much. And part of this was because these areas had just been thinned a few years prior and they'd just gone through one burn rotation. So the plant community wasn't really differentiated yet. Mm-hmm. But what we did find, and what I think is, it's just correlation, not necessarily causation, but if you looked at ragweed and you looked at pokeweed between burned and unburned, it was like 5 to 6 times higher. It was 5 to 6 times greater coverage in the burned. So the percent cover data didn't pick that up because it was those plants were kind of overshadowed by all the other plants that fall into that quote unquote preferred category. But, two of those, really important, highly selected plants by deer had much greater coverage in those burned units. So that it does sound like they were seeking quality in that case versus quantity, because overall the quantity appeared to be the same.
Right. And some of the really interesting things about the study we were talking about, Bronson, with that June timeframe that I found really fascinating is we've monitored which plants deer were selecting, and we have these plants that are always, that really high quality, like you just mentioned, Will. But we also saw basically the dietary breadth of the deer that were using the recently burned areas. They were also really focusing on some plants that we wouldn't traditionally think of as even being deer food. They actually were really high preference when they were in the the fire that occurred in June, but they were not preferred plants when it was burned in March, which I thought was really fascinating. So even the timing right there has turned some plants into food that wouldn't have been food otherwise, which changed how we would measure the abundance of it. Because if we would have just decided, oh, this is a good plant or that's a bad plant or whatever, we would have missed that effect that the timing was also shifting preference for plants, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, especially some of those woody plants that you can find even in areas that basically have no history of fire. Those common species, if you find they're never browsed upon in the areas I just described, but then you introduce them into a burned area, and all of a sudden deer just lighten them up. It's crazy.
Yeah, I think that's really cool and a good way to think about that. So that June time frame might be sort of akin to that summer food plot, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
What about if we fast forward a little bit later in the year? We have burn bans, bad weather. We can go on and on about reasons, that the late summer typically there isn't much fire being put on the ground. But I know based on the burn window thing that we did, not only are let me think about how to say this. Not only do we have many good burn days sort of in that September, October timeframe, but it's also the least utilized. In other words, people don't use that part of the burn window. We don't pull permits then. That's the most underutilized part based on the literature. And I thought it'd be really interesting for us to talk about. Well, we don't necessarily need to get into why that's the least used, but just know if you're out there, even if you have hardwoods, you can probably burn at that time, and you may not traditionally be thinking about that as even being an opportunity. So are there any reasons that we might want to, aside from extending the burn window, that's an obvious one that we keep coming back to, but are there any reasons why we want to use fire on some of our acreage during that time if we're managing for deer?
I would say, Marcus, I don't know if this is the number one reason, but it would be for a lot of people. If you're into deer hunting, you're going to attract deer to those areas that you burned.
So it's sort of like a cool season food plot now.
Yeah. And, we all, like we talked about earlier, we always have to qualify it. It would depend on how close it is to cover, how secure they would feel using it, and so forth. But it is, once again, unless it's, I guess, too late in the year and you're up against, you're going to have a frost 2 weeks later. But you're again going to have one of those pulses of growth of very, very nutritious, naturally occurring forage that deer are going to be attracted to. And, I think the way you kind of coined it there, maybe it wasn't this late, Marcus, but with bow range burning. And essentially meaning that some of these effects will carry over into hunting season, and you can use it strategically for hunting deer.
Sure. Yeah, and that was really the first time that I was thinking about, with the bow range burning. That was the first time I was really intensely thinking about why, reasons that we might want to burn at that time. But yeah, it really, to use a pun, kind of got me fired up about the idea that we don't use that part of the burn window, but there might be some real reasons. And I certainly think that's one good one. Keeping in mind what Will was talking about earlier, treat that kind of like a food plot. If you go and hunt on a food plot and pressure that, deer aren't going to come out in that during hunting season either. We all know that as hunters. But it's sort of the same kind of thing. You don't have that much high quality cover within the burn unit, but you have some really attractive foraging opportunity, assuming that you have enough time in the growing season for it to respond to the fire. So
just think, Marcus, about using, let's say you've got a portion of your property that is generating a lot of cover, and deer are using it for cover. And 100, 200 yards away from that, you've got a cool season food plot. And then just imagine in between those two, at whatever scale you can pull off, you then do some burning and create a corridor linking that cover with the food plot. And just think of all the shot opportunities you could have during bow season by being up in that stand versus being on the edge of the food plot.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's some brilliant strategy there, Ron. I like it.
Yeah, and I'll add to, talking about that late growing season burning. There's some of us and Dr. Harper at University of Tennessee in particular that strongly believes that that's the best time of the year to burn, to control, hardwood sprouts in the understory, if that's what the objective of the burn is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, that's probably true. And by the way, who am I to disagree with Craig when it comes to something related to burning?
Oh, we do it all the time.
For me, like, as scientists, we're all like this, right? I want to see the data, which is the reason that this bigger, large scale project is happening. Right. But I was with Craig a couple of weeks ago, and we went to some of the sites where he had been tinkering around with that. And you can stand there between them. I don't know if either of you have been there, like to Bridgestone Firestone, where he was doing some of the demonstrations.
Mm-mm.
You can stand between where there's same fire return interval, where there's a 1 year or 2 year or whatever. And one of them is dormant season or early growing season, I think is what he has, early growing season. And then comparing that compositionally and structurally to the late growing season. And there is no question that they are different from one another. And in particular, the hardwood component is substantially different. And what I think when we talk about this, something that resonates with me that he says is the fire often has quite different behavior, and it seems to meander a little more with the fall burning in comparison. But when it top kills those hardwoods, they don't recover from it as well, and you have a much higher mortality of those hardwoods. And so you may have more of a patchy looking fire, but in the places where it gets at the hardwoods, they're more often die outright.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that makes sense. I mean, I'm not a tree physiologist, but those trees, when they resprout after fire, a lot of times are having to depend on their energy reserves in their roots, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you burn during that time of the year and force the plant to use some of those reserves to resprout before the end of the growing season, and then it gets killed back by frost, and then it's still dependent on whatever those reserves it didn't use to sprout again, or to green or to leaf out in spring, right? You're kind of forcing it to tap into those reserves twice. So I think that makes some sense. I don't know if that's the mechanism that Craig has proposed or not. That's the way I've been thinking about it. But I think you bring up another interesting point, Marcus, is that the fire behaves differently during that time of the year. And I think that I don't want to discourage anybody from trying to diversify when they burn. But I think that as you get into some of those more non-traditional burn windows, they're non-traditional for a reason. And that's because it becomes more difficult to burn in. And sometimes during that time of the year, you're fighting this battle of one day it won't burn, the next day it'll burn too hot. So as a fire manager, like I said, I highly encourage people to diversify when they burn, but you start having to, again, there's that word nuance, use nuance in those fire prescriptions in fall compared to like in January, where you can get away with burning during a lot more days as long as generally it's not raining, or really high conditions up front coming in.
Much more stable.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think great point. Something that I think has been pretty successful in my program where I'm trying to get people to use fire more often to meet their own objectives, which are often can be accomplished at least to some degree with fire. One of the things that I think it would address what you're saying is the scale of fire and what people think they have to do to accomplish anything. That would be the time if you're not comfortable or you haven't been using some of these more non-traditional times, but you're interested in that, there's no reason that couldn't be 1 acre.
Yeah,
right?
just start
plant
small.
a 1 acre food plot there's no reason you couldn't reduce the scale to a scale that you're comfortable with and that's safe, to get familiar with what you're doing. Maybe you have a 1 acre transition right there between your food plot and your cover, like Bronson was saying. And that could be a really good reason to try that out in a good place where it's really safe, and you have either a green fire break or a brown one. If you've just, you're prepping your food plots, that might be a really good fire break that's super safe. So, I think that's a good point. We're about expanding the burn window, and here we've given a couple of really good reasons why you might want to consider that time, but keep in mind that not all fires are equal, and we have to use it a little differently depending on the context, and some of that context is just conditions that are prevalent in that time of year.
Right. And I know you've talked about this, Marcus, like with the bow range burning stuff, but I'll show students how effectively you can put in fire breaks with just a backpack leaf blower.
Yeah.
Or even a handheld, gas powered one. And because I've got, several research plots that we can't access with heavy equipment. And so that's how we put in our fire breaks every time we burn those. And when I take students out and they see how effective it can be, they're really surprised. And yeah, I mean, we may just be burning 4 or 5 acres at a time, but think about how much time, energy, and effort a lot of people put into half-acre food plots, and I can put in much less of all those things and burn 5 acres and make it have higher quality forage in it.
Sure. And sometimes in some contexts comparable to what you'd put in that food plot.
Right.
So yeah, really good point. I know I have several videos or clips of me that I put in a presentation, and every time I talk about especially burning in upland hardwoods, because people more commonly in that system have the issue with equipment access, and it's a really, just like you said, a really effective way to get a fire break installed is just taking a leaf blower out, and you can establish one pretty quickly without that much effort. So really good point. One thing that I might add, we've talked a lot about how attractive these areas are for deer, and some of the work that I've been tinkering around with, and some with you guys and some in other studies, is we don't typically think about all that browse pressure being important. We're thinking about producing browse for deer, but not thinking about how that browse pressure change might be important to meet your objectives, like if you're trying to control hardwoods. And we have several papers in different stages of publication right now showing that not only is that browse pressure potentially important to do things like help you control hardwoods, especially if you can expand the dietary breadth, but the timing of that interaction could be pretty important too. And particularly during that late summer stress period, if you top kill these hardwoods and more of them are now really high quality foliage, and during that time it's super attractive. Think about what a deer is going to do. It's going to eat all the resprouting vegetation, and it's trying to catch up, like you were saying, Will. And it seems like, based on a lot of those data, which hopefully will be published soon, the mortality rate is probably higher because of the timing of fire and the physiology of the plant, but deer are probably helping us a lot just by eating it constantly as well. And that's just that additional stress on the plants, especially at smaller scales. If it was a small patch where they can really intensively browse every stem in it, that might even be a pretty interesting consequence, that deer are helping you get where you're trying to get in terms of increasing the herbaceous dominance, which is a common objective that we have with these things. So another interesting, more ecological, I guess, way to think about it, but an important one for us as managers to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Marcus, do you ever think, I listened to your episode with the quail folk,
mm-hmm.
and of course, quail, a lot different than deer, a lot more fire dependent. Take fire out of the system, they pretty much don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing, working with you over the years and listening to other perspective from Bob White's, could you boil it down for people, saying the number one priority is burn? That's number one, burn. And by like the examples you've given by extending that burn window for pretty much the entire year, it is then giving you the opportunity to do so. And we can all, Will, Marcus, me, we can be a little bit more strategic. A lot of this is research. We can allocate time and resources a little bit better to, we're going to put June on the calendar to get it done. That's not a reality for a lot of people. Do you think, Marcus and Will, over a 5-year span or longer, that if you just burn, and sometimes it gets done in March, sometimes it doesn't get done until April, sometimes it July or August, that a lot of these details just kind of work themselves out, that the net effect you're going to see from number one, just getting it done, and then allowing the calendar and your time to incorporate some diversity and when you're getting it done is just going to be beneficial.
Yeah, I think you're right, Bronson, from my perspective, because landowners normally, in most contexts, unless there's a land manager whose job is to do nothing else except manage the land, and they're there at all times to do that, most landowners don't have that. They are their land manager, and they have enough barriers to being out on the property doing things that you probably would end up with some diversity no matter what, just because you're not going to be able to use every burn day during each window. And if you're prioritizing burning because you want to meet some habitat management objective, I think you're probably right. In most cases, as long as you're, that's, I guess we harp on that a lot, is just expanding the burn window so that you can get your burning done, for most people will result in a high diversity of fires, because you start thinking, oh, well, I didn't get my burning done in February, so I'll try in April, or, didn't get all that burning done, so I've got this pine stand that I could probably get during June. And then, well, we still have these 2 5-acre blocks over here. We could get those in September. I think a lot of people probably would end up in that wagon. But right now, traditionally, we're not even thinking about that September window being on the plate, right? It's not even an option. And that's kind of, I think, what's important with our discussion that we've had here, is not only is that an option, there are also some reasons why you might want to take advantage of that option.
Yeah, I mean, I think to boil it down as simply as possible, if you have all the conditions the same, as far as, species, the tree basal area, all that kind of stuff, and you burn one every 2 to 3 years over time, over a 10-year period, and you don't the other one, at the end of that 10-year period, maybe a little bit longer, depending where you are, you're going to have orders of magnitude more forage in the stand that's been burned versus the stand that's unburned. So first and foremost, like you said, Bronson, burn. And then I think secondary to that is to consider fire frequency, how often we're burning. And then, season probably adds a few percentage points in favor of providing more forage of this type during one time of the year versus the other. So it's kind of like the third order on the hierarchy of importance of burning. So first of all, burn. Second of all, burn at the right frequency, depending on the species you're managing for. In this case, we're talking about deer. And then third, start thinking about season.
Yeah, I think that's a
good point.
Great point. Well, and that probably pretty much sums it up. That's probably a good place for us to stop. But I appreciate
don't mess it up and keep talking, huh, Marcus?
Yeah, let me just go ahead and stop now before I mess that up. Yeah, that's right. I think ultimately, even when you're managing for one species, you still want diversity, and that might come about in several different ways. But if you think about it in an order of effect, get fire on the ground, that's going to help you accomplish your objectives first and foremost. And then there are lots of ways that you can manipulate that to take advantage of opportunities that can help you better meet specific objectives for the same species. Well, before we go, I always like to do this with the guests. If folks are really interested in getting in contact with you for one reason or another, where is it best to do that?
Yeah, you can look me up on Auburn University School of Forestry and Wildlife Sciences. I'm there in the faculty directory if you want to call or email. I'm also available on Instagram and Facebook. My Instagram is Dr. as in Dr_Will_Gulsby. And then if you don't do Instagram, just Facebook, you can also send me a friend request on there. And that's pretty much just a professional page. So, I can usually see anybody that comes on that's got pictures of deer in their profile pictures, deer and turkeys and stuff like that. Okay, they're actually coming to me for information, so I'll add you right away.
Bronson?
Yeah, so you can find me, also Steve with the MSU Deer Lab. Just go to our website, msudeerlab.com, and there our contact info is there. We also do a lot of social media, but I will warn you that for me, that's kind of a one-way form of communication, meaning we put the information out. I'm not good. Sorry, Will, I'm not young enough. I'm not good at responding to the messages that come back, and I don't check it that often. So if you really want to send me a message, the best way to do it, go to our website, get my email, shoot me an email, and I'll do everything I can to get back with you.
Yeah, and of course, folks that are interested in contacting me, they can find us on social media at UF Deer Lab, and I'm happy to answer phone calls. I do it a lot. A lot of our listeners have been reaching out for different things, so really appreciate that and happy to help. So I appreciate you guys taking some time to talk about this with me, and again, thank you for all the information that you're putting out there and all the work that you're doing. I think it's a great thing for the resource and a great thing for land managers that are interested in utilizing that information. So really appreciate that, guys.
Yeah, I enjoyed this. Thanks for having me on, Marcus.
Yeah, happy to help, Marcus. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time. Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network, funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.